So, once upon a time, there was a little girl who grew up to be a little teenager, and this little teenager, she moved to a new place at a really hard time to move to a new place, because she was a sophomore in high school. Which, if you've been there in the same place forever, is always a hard time. But especially starting in a new place. And she wasn't exactly the most outgoing, wasn't exactly the most loud. And so she went to her first day, she got herself all geared up. And she went to her first day and she tried. Her parents had said, you gotta talk to people, you gotta make the friends, you gotta try. And so she would reach out and she would try, and it was almost like people weren't seeing her. Every time she would try, she would almost as if she didn't exist. And that started to get her really, really sad. And then one day, after weeks and weeks of trying, she raised her hand to talk in class, and it was like the teacher didn't even see her. And she looked up at the tip of her hand, and she saw her fingers start to disappear.
Ooh.
And this was really frightening, and so it just slowly came down, and all of a sudden her whole hand disappeared. And she tried waving it and tried shaking it, and she was like, teacher, excuse me. And slowly it went down the rest of her hand, and she was starting to disappear. And she got up. She didn't clearly have to ask to leave the room because nobody could see her. And she went out into the hallway and she ran. She tried bumping into people. And slowly her entire body was disappearing. Slowly she was becoming invisible. And it made her so sad because she was already feeling disconnected. She was already feeling afraid of being in this new place. And all of a sudden, she was gone. But right then, off in the distance, first heard her baby cry. And then after that, she heard this little voice say, would you like to see my acrobatic worms?
Whoa.
And she turned around and she said, acrobatic worms? And sure enough, there was this little guy who was walking the halls with a handful of earthworms, which was a little gross in the beginning. And he said, would you like to see my acrobatic worms? And she said, what are you talking about? You can see me? And he said, well, of course I can see you. And she had heard about this guy. She had heard about this kid with the acrobatic worms, and apparently they did contortionists, and apparently they did all sorts of tricks, which was totally disgusting, and she was trying to show them to her. She said, but wait, why can you see me? He said, I know exactly what you're going through. You see, when I started my acrobatic worm show, some people didn't understand. Some people didn't want to look at me. Some people didn't want to see where I was, and I too got really sad. And I felt disconnected, I felt alone, I felt like I had almost disappeared. And then my one wise worm who had just suffered a trapeze accident, which horribly rendered him unable to perform the duties of the acrobatic worms. That wise worm said to him, because he could talk to the worms too, the worm said to him, sometimes all you need is to know that I see you. And the worm, with whatever worms look with, one of his tails, both of his tails, looked right at him. Right at him. And all of a sudden, the boy with the worms, he could feel it. And he knew that he wasn't disconnected. He knew that right then in that one moment, at least that worm saw him. And so, sure enough, he told the girl, he says, I see you right now. And maybe that's enough. And she looked right into his eyes. And he looked right into her eyes. And something started to change. And she could feel herself. She looked down and she could see her heart come back. She could see her body slowly come back into sight. And sometimes that's all we need. Sometimes all of you may feel disconnected, may feel alone, but we are so blessed to have each other, to have the three of us, to have the all of us, to look in the eye, to hold in the hand, and to remember that really we aren't alone. Amen. So we'll slowly and gently go off to class.